In the desert silence where engines once screamed and tempers once flared, Pepe's towing service still lingers like a ghost. Rusted tow hooks hang motionless. The office door, sun-bleached and scarred, no longer opens. Yet the story of what truly happened here refuses to die. It begins not with failure, but with loyalty. A man answering calls at all hours, pulling strangers out of wreckage, out of ditches, out of desperation. Over time, that same loyalty became a trap, tightening slowly, invisibly, until the weight of responsibility crushed everything beneath it. Whispers spread through the town. Some said money destroyed it. Others blamed betrayal or the unforgiving economics of survival in a place forgotten by progress. But behind the rumors lived a deeper truth, one rooted in exhaustion, pride, and the quiet fear of becoming irrelevant. What happens when a man builds his identity entirely around being needed, only to watch the world stop calling? And when the tow trucks finally went silent, was it the end of a business, or the end of something far more personal? The sun had barely lifted itself over the horizon, but the heat already pressed against the cracked asphalt, baking the roadside in a shimmer of mirage-like distortion. Pepe's towing service started each day before most of the town even stirred. The garage, a low-slung structure of peeling paint and dented steel, smelled of motor oil, gasoline, and the faint tang of sweat that clung to worn leather seats. Headlights pierced the early morning dust as Pepe slid into the driver's seat, the rumble of the engine vibrating through his chest like a heartbeat. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The machines answered him in clicks, groans, and whines, ready to obey his silent command. From the outset, Pepe had been the one people counted on. A sedan stranded in the middle of the highway, a pickup teetering over a shallow embankment. The cries of frightened strangers reached him before the details of the accidents themselves, and he moved like a shadow across the landscape, pulling them back from the edge. Each rescue was a surge of adrenaline, a reaffirmation that he was needed, that he mattered, that the world could not do without him. But beneath that exterior of purpose, a quieter tension began to coil. Nights bled into mornings without distinction, the hours spent leaning over engines or grappling with twisted metal stealing both his body and his spirit. His hands were always grimy, nails blackened, skin cracked, a visible testament to the cost of devotion. Inside, the weight of expectation pressed on his chest. With every successful tow, Pepe's sense of self fused further with the work itself. To rest felt like treachery. Sleep was a luxury, warmth and food secondary to duty. Even as he saved lives, small fractures formed in the foundation of his personal world. Family dinners missed, birthdays forgotten, conversations reduced to hurried waves from the cab of his truck. Friends called and were met with apologies, half-smiles, promises to catch up soon, that never materialized. Each day, the road demanded more and Pepe gave more, until the line between man and machine began to blur. He was not merely running a towing service. He was the service incarnate, every engine, every horn, every panicked call a reflection of his identity. The town, ever reliant on his presence, offered gratitude but no respite. The trucks became extensions of his own body, their lights and sirens a constant heartbeat against the silence of empty streets. Yet even as he drove from one emergency to the next, a quiet unease began to whisper. The road was endless, and it would not pause. Exhaustion was no longer an adversary. It was a predator, circling patiently, waiting for the moment when the man who never slept would finally falter. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the dust and asphalt in blinding clarity, Pepe's phone rang. A call that would pull him into a night unlike any other, a night where the limits of loyalty, stamina, and purpose would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. How long could one man outrun exhaustion before it finally caught him? The glow of fluorescent lights flickered above the office of Pepe's towing service, casting harsh shadows across the walls lined with yellowed invoices, faded maps, and photographs of past rescues. Frozen moments of triumph now heavy with quiet tension. Pepe sat behind the desk, shoulders slumped, eyes tracing the same pattern of scratches in the wood he had memorized years ago. Every ring of the phone was a summons, a reminder that the world relied on him, that lives hung precariously on his immediate response. Gratitude filled the air in those calls, but it was laced with expectation, a weight that bore down on him invisibly, shaping each breath, each decision. The emotional landscape of Pepe's life had shifted from pride to obligation. He was no longer merely a man performing a service. He was a linchpin in a community's fragile ecosystem. Strangers depended on him, co-workers deferred to him, even his own family measured their lives against his availability. Each tow, each emergency, was a small victory, yet the victories accumulated into exhaustion, isolation, and an almost imperceptible erosion of self. He laughed less, paused less, slept less. The toll was visible in the deep lines carving across his face, in the tremor that occasionally rattled his hands as he gripped the steering wheel at 3 a.m., in the hollow ache behind his eyes that no coffee could banish. Pepe's pride prevented him from seeking help. Asking for support felt like admitting weakness, betraying the image of the man who could always be counted on. The very identity he had constructed, tireless, reliable, indispensable, now imprisoned him. Financial strain coiled silently beneath the surface. Equipment needing repair, insurance bills, fuel costs, calls answered without expectation of pay. Every decision to absorb the cost, every extra mile driven, became a thread in the tightening noose of responsibility. He convinced himself that perseverance was enough, that effort alone could bridge the widening gaps. Yet the cracks deepened. Relationships thinned under the pressure. Friends stopped calling. Family dinners went unattended. Even the small town that once celebrated his dependability now assumed it was a given, no longer a miracle. In the quiet hours of the night, when the last tow truck returned to the yard and the world seemed to exhale, Pepe felt the weight of being essential as a quiet suffocation. Each success brought relief, but also a gnawing awareness that he could not keep this pace forever. And then, a call came, faint at first, almost dismissible. A stranded car on a lonely stretch of highway. He hesitated, just for a moment, but that pause felt unnatural, dangerous. The road waited, indifferent, and for the first time, a terrifying thought crept into his mind. What if the man everyone depended on could fail? What if the next call went unanswered? The chapter closes on that unspoken dread, an uncharted territory of uncertainty. Pepe left the office, keys in hand, engine humming like a nervous heartbeat, unaware that the simple act of answering the next call would lead him into a night that could change everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and survival. The town was quieter now, though no less unforgiving. Streets once dotted with stranded cars and urgent flares now lay empty, the occasional rumble of distant engines a faint echo against the vast, sun-baked horizon. Pepe drove through these streets in his worn truck, the hum of the engine a thin thread holding him to purpose, but even that sound felt hollow. The calls, once relentless and life-defining, had slowed, leaving a strange, suffocating silence that pressed against his chest like heat against asphalt. Each day, he awoke with the same ritualistic motion. Check the phones, check the garage, check the trucks. But the world no longer demanded his presence with the same intensity. This slowing was not simply a matter of business. It was a psychological erosion. Pepe's identity, fused so completely with his work, trembled on the edge of invisibility. He prowled the highways, eyes scanning for the faintest signal of trouble, desperate to recreate the urgency that had once justified every sacrifice. His pride, once a shield, now felt like shackles. He refused to reduce the pace, to adapt, to accept that the world had moved forward while he remained tethered to the past. Each empty mile was a whisper of irrelevance. Each silent intersection a mirror reflecting a man slowly losing his place in the very world he had fought to serve. Financial strain compounded the emotional weight. Equipment aged, the trucks groaning with fatigue that mirrored his own. Fuel bills rose, payments stacked, yet every abandoned car or unanswered call felt like a personal failure, a verdict against the man who had always been indispensable. The community that once depended on him continued to offer gratitude but withheld tangible support. His isolation grew, a quiet, creeping presence that accompanied every turn of the wheel. Nights spent waiting for calls that never came were filled with the sounds of his own heartbeat and the whisper of wind across empty roads. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it was restless, haunted by imagined emergencies and the gnawing fear of irrelevance. Pepe's inner monologue became a cycle of fear and determination. If I stop, who will answer? If I pause, what will collapse? His thoughts were a labyrinth of obligation, each corner echoing with the faces of people he had helped, and the creeping dread that he might be unable to help the next time. The town, indifferent in its own way, moved on. New tow services appeared, slicker and faster, capitalizing on the same market Pepe had once dominated with grit and persistence. Competition, though subtle, was a sting. He tried to ignore it, but every missed call, every quiet morning without urgency, reminded him that the world did not wait for those who clung too tightly to the past. And then came the decision, small, rational, necessary, but with consequences that Pepe could not yet comprehend. He chose a route he had avoided before, a shortcut to a call that felt routine but was fraught with danger. A narrow bridge, weakened guardrails, an embankment that had claimed vehicles before. The choice was a test of instinct, of skill, of perseverance, but also a subtle acknowledgement that he could no longer outrun the encroaching reality of loss and change. As the tires met the rough asphalt and the headlights cut through the darkening dusk, Pepe's chest tightened. The night stretched ahead like an abyss, and the silent streets whispered a terrifying question. What happens when the man who has always answered cannot answer the one call that truly matters? The garage smelled of rust, oil, and the faint, lingering trace of burnt rubber. Dust particles danced in the narrow shafts of light slicing through the grimy windows, illuminating the stillness that had settled over Pepe's towing service like a suffocating fog. The trucks, once roaring beasts of salvation, sat motionless, their tires cracked, their metal bodies dulled by sun and neglect. The office, littered with unpaid bills, unopened letters, and the occasional faded photograph of past rescues, seemed almost alive with echoes of urgency now silenced. Each object, each surface, whispered of a time when life depended on the sound of sirens and the hum of engines, a time when Pepe himself was indispensable. Pepe moved through the space with slow, deliberate steps, hands brushing against toolboxes, dashboards, the cold steel of a winch he had used 1,000 times. The silence pressed against him, heavier than the summer heat outside. Guilt and shame settled deep in his chest, gnawing quietly, invisibly, at the man who had once defined himself entirely by being needed. He could feel the weight of the town's eyes, even absent. Their expectations lingered like shadows. Fear rose unbidden. Fear of judgment, fear of memory, fear of being forgotten in a world that had once clung to his every movement with desperate reliance. Financial ruin had arrived not as a sudden blow but as a creeping inevitability. Licenses expired, creditors called, equipment was repossessed. The physical collapse of the business mirrored the inner collapse Pepe felt in every sinew, in every memory of missed birthdays and conversations he could no longer repair. Every corner of the yard reminded him of hours sacrificed, relationships strained, and nights spent answering calls that no longer came. The silence was a verdict, and yet, amidst the darkness, a strange, fragile clarity began to emerge. Pepe, stripped bare by loss, began to confront the painful truth that identity, purpose, and worth could not exist solely within the confines of a business, however life-saving it had once been. The road, indifferent and endless, had outlasted him, yet in its quiet persistence, he glimpsed the faintest possibility of something beyond duty. As night fell, the shadows lengthened across the yard, stretching like hands reaching toward him. The trucks stood like monuments to what had been sacrificed. And in that profound silence, Pepe realized that the world would move on with or without him, that the question was no longer whether he could answer the next call, but whether he could answer the call to live again. The chapter closes with the faint ringing of a distant phone. Somewhere he could not yet reach. A reminder that the world is both cruel and persistent, and that the next challenge may not come from the streets or the stranded cars, but from within himself. The echo of that sound leaves him frozen, caught between despair and the first whisper of rebirth, the unknown stretching ahead like an endless, dark highway. The yard was quiet now, abandoned except for the rusting hulks of trucks that once roared with purpose. The office door hung crooked on its hinges, the windows streaked with dust and sunlight, the air thick with the memory of effort, sacrifice, and a relentless pace that had defined Pepe's existence. The town had moved on, as towns always do, leaving behind only the faint echoes of what had been. Yet in those echoes, Pepe felt a resonance, a fragile reminder that the impact of his life was not measured solely by the clamor of sirens or the contracts he had fulfilled, but by the lives he had touched in moments of desperation, when one man's presence could make the difference between despair and salvation. Pepe walked slowly among the trucks, fingers brushing the faded paint and worn metal. Each vehicle was a monument to relentless dedication, to nights spent in sweat and dust, to the quiet terror of roads that demanded vigilance at every turn. He closed his eyes and inhaled the scent of oil and asphalt, a sensory imprint of years spent at the edge of exhaustion. The weight of identity, so long entwined with work, now pressed differently, less with urgency, more with reflection. Loss had stripped him of everything external, yet it had opened the narrowest window to understanding something deeper. Purpose is never entirely contained in duty, and value is not always measured in action alone. The town's gratitude had shifted, intangible but persistent. Stories circulated of a man who had appeared when the world faltered, of headlights cutting through darkness, of strength offered without question. Faces he would never know, strangers, neighbors, families, remembered, quietly, the interventions that had saved them from isolation, danger, or despair. Pepe's service had ended, but its consequences endured, like a faint hum beneath the surface of a life now paused. In the cool light of dawn, Pepe finally let the trucks rest, finally let the silence settle, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to breathe without anticipation. The road remained outside, indifferent and endless, yet he no longer feared it. Instead, he observed it, contemplative, a reminder that life carries forward, with or without the engines that once defined it. And in that quiet reflection, a question lingered, not about success or failure or survival, but about memory and meaning. When a service disappears, when the sirens cease, does its purpose vanish with it? Or does it persist in the quiet gratitude, the unseen impact, and the lives it once touched? Pepe stood alone among the ghosts of his past, understanding that some things endure in ways the eye cannot measure, and that legacy is a life's echo rather than its roar. The chapter and the story closes with him turning away from the yard, the morning light spilling across the empty road, leaving the audience suspended in the delicate tension between ending and continuation, between loss and the quiet possibility of rebirth.